Welcome to tonight's lecture, hosted by the Hurley Heritage Society. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. My name's Raleigh Green. I'm a board member of the Hurley Heritage Society and the organizer of tonight's lecture. I'm pleased to host our presentation. Now, before we get started, let me give you some quick notes. First, the Hurley Heritage Society Museum's opening day for the 2024 season is Saturday, May 4th from 1 to 4 p.m. I hope to see many of you there. And mark your calendars, the 2024 Hurley Heritage Rooster Auction will be hosted on Friday, June 7th. Local artists have beautifully painted 25 handcrafted metal roosters, the iconic symbol of Hurley, and the metal roosters made by Hurley resident Wayne Woligerski of Patentee Manor will be on display opening weekend at the museum. And the Hurley Heritage Society is also currently having its annual plant sale. Orders may be made up until April 30th. Order forms are available on our website. A few housekeeping notes. Please be sure you're on mute so that everyone can hear the guest speaker, that there are no interruptions. And during the presentation, if you have a question, feel free to use the chat feature and send your questions ahead of time, and they'll be answered either during the presentation or at the end. Following the presentation, we'll have a nice Q&A as well. At the conclusion of the formal presentation, at that point, you can unmute yourselves. The presentation is being recorded and will be posted to our the Hurley Heritage Society website and Facebook in the coming days. So tonight's presentation, When Archaeology and Development Collide, how New York State evaluates potential archaeological sites in areas of proposed development. It explores what happens if you find, say, an arrowhead in your backyard, a piece of pottery, or what happens if a developer finds them on their planned site for development, or even what happens if a planning board determines that a project is what's called a type 2 action, no effect, and oops, a graveyard is bulldozed. So the collision of history and archaeology and development are by no means specific to the Hudson Valley. This and like challenges are commonplace throughout the world, and most nations have specific protocols and laws as to what to do. Broadly speaking, the practice of cultural resource management, otherwise known as CRM, is used to help guide smart, sustainable economic development projects and safeguard important historic and cultural heritage assets. CRM is a process that works to ensure two very important values can coexist in our society: progress and the protection of important cultural heritage. Practiced widely around the world, CRM is essential in locations with deep and rich cultural heritage. So tonight's speaker, Professor Joe Diamond, will discuss CRM and surrounding topics. Dr. Diamond is a professor of anthropology and archaeology at SUNY New Paltz. He also works with state and local governments, developers, nonprofits on a variety of cultural resource management projects to document, assess, and provide insight into archaeological sites that may contain historic and cultural heritage assets. These insights then assist in guiding next steps in a proposed development project. Professor Diamond is also the vice president of the New York Archaeological Council. So, without further delay, let me introduce our guest speaker, Professor Joe Diamond. Welcome.
Thanks, Raleigh. So I've been kind of thinking about how to do this, and I think what I'm going to do is take you back to the 1970s when I first started doing archaeology, and explain how the State Historic Preservation Office and the way that we look at archaeological sites has changed since then. Sound okay?
Sure.
So I did my first field school in 1976, and right after that, I got into CRM by working with a company up in Albany. At that particular point in 1970s, there was something called circles and squares at the State Historic Preservation Office. Circles were Native American pre-contact sites. Squares were historic archaeological sites. And what they did was they kept these on maps USGS maps, and there would be a circle, and then there'd be a little line going out, and then it would basically give the site number. And so to basically look at their files, though, you had to go to two different places because they weren't sharing information. So to basically see where sites were, you would have to go to the New York State Museum for the State Museum sites, and then you had to drive up to Peebles Island. You'd have to go to a different building in downtown Albany for the State Historic Preservation Office sites. So you had to go up to Albany for most of a day. So one of the things that happened in the 70s was that Bob Bettinger of NYU was contracted by the State Historic Preservation Office to look at their circles and squares policy. And what he found was that basically the way that New York State was running its archaeological and historic preservation plan was good for two things. The first was to basically, archaeologists were finding sites we already knew about. So basically, people were relocating where a circle was, or relocating a square, but they weren't doing anything predictive. They weren't finding new sites. So what happened after that, basically in the 1980s and early 90s, was that somebody had to kind of make a decision about whether a site was, or location, I should say, was sensitive, that it might have an archaeological site on it. So that was tasked to Beth Wellman at the New York State Museum. So what we would do at that point is basically take a USGS, a copy of a USGS map, put our little project location on there, send it to her with a little form that they gave us, and we'd give them all the information about it. We'd send it to Beth, wait about 2 weeks, she'd send it back, and she would identify the project area as high, moderate, or low sensitivity to prehistoric or pre-contact archaeological resources. And so what Beth was doing was she was looking at the soils, she was looking at proximity to water, she was looking at slope. Is this project area on the side of a mountain? Is it in 15 to 20% slope? Those are the kind of locations that people generally don't want to live. So what that did for a long time was it gave us an additional kind of layer of somebody saying, okay, you need to do a survey, because if you're like contacted by a developer and you tell them that you need a survey at that particular point, they're going to say, well, how do you know that? So this kind of gave contract archaeologists all across New York State a little bit of kind of oomph when it came to the idea that a archaeological survey should be undertaken. So again, there was that idea of and this is from the 1970s all the way up until the moment. You're looking at the number of sites within a 1 mile radius. So you kind of go to the outside edges of your project area, and basically you kind of draw a circle out about 1 mile, and then you do a what's called a literature search of everything that's either within your project or project area or on the edge of it. The other thing is you might see a situation where within a 1 mile radius, you've got a whole series of sites, let's say along a river or a creek, and they're kind of working, they're all on your side of the creek, and basically they're all on the same landforms that you have within your project area, which means you're probably going to have archaeological sites that are similar to that in your project area. So that's a little bit more predictive. It's not just, oh, there's no circles, there's no squares here, you don't have to do any archaeology, which is kind of the way it was back in the 70s. And so this whole idea of having the State Museum give us an evaluation was really kind of critical. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. So one of the things that that happened in the 1970s, in 1975, you have SECRA, which is not a particularly strong law when it comes to protecting or preserving or even identifying archaeological resources. It relies on a planning board to basically go through what, I have a cat in here that's starting to meow, that expects a planning board to actually do due diligence. And from what I saw across New York State back in the especially the 80s and 90s, very few actually lived up to that. The other thing about SECRA is that, and even to this day, there's no provision in it for the reports that are sent into individual planning boards to go to the State Historic Preservation Office or to go to the New York State Museum. So back in the 80s and early 90s, I did a lot of projects down in Westchester County in one particular township. After every time I would find sites, I would go up to the New York State Museum, do another one in that township. And one of the things I realized was that the people on the planning board in this particular town were not sending the forms up to the State Historic Preservation Office or the New York State Museum. So what I had to do is make copies of them and then bring them up and put them, have people put them on the maps to kind of keep them updated. So there's no provision in that in SECRA. In 1980, we have New York State 1409, which is kind of based on Section 106 of the federal regs. What happens is it links projects to state permits. So, for example, if you need a curb cut, for example, if you're on like a state highway and you need a curb cut for, let's say, 2 lanes of traffic going into a development, even a small curb cut, for example, for a store or something kind of like that, it kicks in the need for an archaeological survey. If you need a SWIP, a stormwater prevention plan, that will also kick in the need for an archaeological survey, because what DEC does, it partners with SHPO, and it doesn't really deal with the SWIP until the archaeological portion of the project has been dealt with. Other ones include stream or wetland crossings. Those will all require to go through Section 1409 also. Getting to the arrowhead in your backyard, which I just wrote down, because we have private property regs in the United States. If you find an arrowhead in your backyard, essentially it's your arrowhead. You can do anything with it if you want. If you find artifacts on your property, they're your artifacts. When I've done archaeological excavations for people, for example, in Hurley, when we did the Van Dusen house back in the 90s, I had a discussion with Iris and John Osius about the disposition of the artifacts. And in that particular case, they really didn't want the artifacts, but they really wanted something more, which was a tax write-off. So what I did was I added up the amount of hours for all of the time we spent there at different levels of pay grades for field techs and everything else, analysis and everything, and then came up with an amount, a financial amount, which was rather substantial because it was a very it was a 2-year project. So they were somewhat amazed by the number I came up with. So that's one way of kind of dealing with that. If you're finding artifacts in your yard, again, you probably live on an archaeological site, and that's not a particularly bad thing. It gets a little more complicated if you have human remains on your property. So just to add in something that just happened, on August 1st, 2023, a new bill was signed by Governor Hochul, which is called Discovery and Disposition of Human Remains and Funerary Objects. So this particular law has to do with people, it's called inadvertent discovery. So if you're, let's say, digging a swimming pool, if a company is putting in a power line or a water line or a sewer line or something kind of like that, and they come across human remains, this new law basically sets forth a whole bunch of guidelines as well as penalties for people that don't report the human remains. So if you find human remains and you don't report them, and somebody in the state government or the local government finds out, it's a Class E felony, which is kind of the lower of the 5 felonies in New York State. And of course, that's usually a minimum of 1 year in jail, up to 5 years. And there are also other penalties for if you, let's say, take grave goods and the burial, and you don't report it. So that was set up. That's something that NYAC has been working on since the 1980s. It's gone through a whole bunch of iterations since the 1980s. I don't even know if all the people in NYAC are particularly happy with what was signed, but basically, most of it is designed for Native American burials. Although there is like a small provision for, let's say, Euro-American or African American burials. But again, there are a whole bunch of problems with the bill I still see. One of them being a 90-day turnaround. So if a company is, let's say, putting in a water line or a sewer line, or they're building a building, or somebody's having a pool put in, there are not going to be a lot of companies that are going to stop, report this, and wait 90 days. So it still has kind of the same problems it did in terms of discussions that we've been talking about for a long time. It also has a problem with funding also, because the property owner has to fund everything. So it's somewhat onerous, I believe, for the property owner. And of course, we had talked in the past about, having something like a fund for this. It could be set up by developers. It could be set up by municipalities. But at this particular point, it's still being funded by the homeowner. What else could I tell you? So let me tell you about how the how SECRA works, because SECRA is one of the ones that most people are probably dealing with. So here's what happens in SECRA. A developer puts forth a development. They get before the planning board. They present everything. The planning board will determine whether they need an environmental assessment form done. They'll also determine whether it's a type 1 action, which means you need to go through the full steps having to do with archaeology. A type 2 action, which means no impact, or an unlisted action, which could even kick back to a type 1, depending on the situation. So if you have let's say, a type 1 action and you need to do an archaeological survey, it's broken up into essentially 4 parts. The phase 1A is a literature search. You basically, and we used to, as I mentioned earlier, we used to have to go to the State Museum and also the State Historic Preservation Office to look at their physical maps. That's not the case anymore, because all of this has been digitized, and you just go to the CRIS system, and you can look at where all the sites are and then click on different folders to get information about them. So the literature search has to do with pre-contact sites that are within 1 mile radius, historic sites that are within a 1 mile radius, National Register sites that are within a 1 mile radius. You're also in the phase 1A looking at the soils. Are you on sandy soils? Are you on clay? How close are you to water? What else? The size of your site. And then basically, and that goes into the one section. You have a pre-contact section. You have a historic section. And then the other thing you do is you also look at historic maps. So for Ulster County, it would be the 1854 Brink and Tilson, the 1856 French map, 1875 Beers. If you're working along the Hudson, the 1864 Lloyd map. Then you get to the 1891 Beers map of the Hudson Valley. And then when you get into late 19th, early 20th century, you can start looking at USGS maps, which are really helpful and very, very accurate. And then if you're working, let's say, Kingston or Saugerties or a city, then you can start to look at Sanborn fire insurance maps, which are really, really helpful. They're great for size of buildings, what they're constructed with, how big the lots are, where the privies are, where the cisterns are, what the buildings are made out of, and really, really good stuff. Also lot lines. I mean, the lot lines are all clearly delineated. So you do the phase 1A. At the end of the phase 1A, you have to kind of evaluate whether or not the project area needs a phase 1B. And as I said before, this is where Beth Wellman came in really kind of handy, because she could say, okay, you're in an area that has moderate to high probability of having a pre-contact site. So that would you could suggest a phase 1B. And of course, whoever you're working for could say, well, I don't want to do a phase 1B. And so then you could, maybe duke it out a bit. After section 1409 kicked in, essentially when people are applying for different permits, the State Historic Preservation Office now kind of rarely asks for phase 1A. They almost always ask for phase 1A, 1B. So before I go to phase 1B, does anybody have any questions? I don't see anything popping up. Oh, okay, yeah. Glenn, if remains are discovered on state lands, that's kind of totally different, because what happens then, that is between the State Historic Preservation Office, the New York State archaeologist, Chris Reith, probably Lisa Anderson from NYSEM would be in on that also, and it would also be you'd have those two agencies dealing with what particular tribe the lands were found on. So if it's on any one of the Haudenosaunee reservations, it would be between that particular group, like the Mohawk, the New York State Museum, and SHPO. And of course, the New York State burial law would also kick in, the one that was signed in August 1st. Can you pin the link for CRS maps? You really can't get into that, because it's reserved for archaeologists only. One of the things that archaeologists are particularly concerned about in New York State is the fact that when archaeological information gets out, people will take the information and loot the archaeological site. So for those of you that are familiar with Bob Funk's recent contributions to Hudson Valley prehistory, one of the things that he told me was that when people were buying that map and this, that report from the State Museum in the 1970s, they would call him up in his office and ask him where good places to dig, because basically they had the map in the front of his volume, and they would just contact the people and just go there and dig. So as a consequence of that, we become very leery about locating sites anywhere outside of Chris. So when I publish an article, I try to, on an archaeological site, I try to be as vague as possible, like really vague, like, yeah, really vague. Or I use the New York State Museum number. So if I know of an archaeological site that I'm working on, I'll get a New York State Museum number for it. I will publish under that number. And then basically after it's published, I'll send the PDF to the State Museum and the State Historic Preservation Office. Other questions? Okay, so let's say, you're in a location that has moderate to high probability. Or if it's more recent, if the State Historic Preservation Office just says you need a full phase 1 survey. So what you do is you basically go out, in New York State, you're basically shovel testing every 50 feet on a grid. In Vermont, it's every 25 feet, but in New York State, it's every 50. So you put up a grid, every 50 feet you go, you dig a shovel test, you screen it through a 1/4-inch mesh, and then basically you look for artifacts. If you're in a plowed field, you might find Native American artifacts. You also might find historic artifacts that were put on the honey wagon with manure back in the 18th or 19th century. That stuff gets kind of spread around the fields, and it's not uncommon in a former plowed field to find historic ceramics, nails, broken glass, window glass, that kind of thing. So that happens all the time. So you go through the phase 1 shovel testing. If you don't find anything, it basically ends right there. So you basically submit the report to the State Historic Preservation Office. You say you don't have anything. And of course, you have to document everything. You have to have maps of where your shovel tests are. You have to have an appendix that has all of the shovel tests that you did that are numbered, that are on your site map. You have to have site photos showing, I'm sorry, project area photos showing where you're doing all this. And then you have to kind of write about what you found or what you didn't find. So if you didn't find anything, it's over with. If you do find something, let's say you find about 20 or 30 pieces of debitage, which are the little flakes that come off when you're making stone tools. What you do is, if you find one of those in your in the phase 1B, you can put shovel tests around it to see if it's significant. If you find more stuff, then what's going to happen is you're going to go to what's called a phase 2. So for the phase 2, you basically put together a plan with the State Historic Preservation Office about what you're going to do, what you've already found there, what you're going to do, how many shovel tests you're going to put in, what kind of grid you're going to do, how many 1 meter squares you're going to put in. And so then you basically go out, you put the your shovel tests and 1 meter squares in, and what you're looking for in the phase 2 is what are called diagnostic artifacts. So you're looking for, let's say, Native American pottery, you're looking for projectile points, you're looking for features that might have charcoal or carbon in them, plant processing tools, anything like that. If you don't find any of that stuff, if you just basically find more debitage, and you even open up more squares and you're just getting debitage, there's the possibility that the site is not going to be what's considered eligible to the National Register of Historic Places. This idea of eligibility is kind of a placeholder. It doesn't mean it's, you're basically in the phase 2 determining whether or not the site meets eligibility criteria, which is really open-ended. It's the sentence has to do with whether or not the site can contribute to our understanding of history or prehistory, which is really wide open. So if you're just getting little pieces of debitage and you don't have anything diagnostic, the possibility is that it's going to kind of end right there. So that would end at the phase 2. If, however, you find features like hearts, storage pits, if you find pre-contact pottery, projectile points, other categories of functional tools, then